My dad's face went white first. Then his jaw just stopped moving mid-sentence, like someone had hit pause on him in front of 40 guests holding champagne flutes. I remember thinking, distantly, that I'd never seen him look small before. Frank Whitlow did not do small. But there he was, frozen, while a decorated Special Forces officer stood between us with her hand still half raised from our handshake, staring at my wrist like she'd seen a ghost. Which, in a way, she had. To understand how it came to this, I have to take you back about 6 years, to the night I came home from my last deployment and found out my own family had already decided who I was before I ever said a word. My name's Daniel Whitlow. I'm the younger of 2 sons. My brother Mark is the one everyone in my family actually sees. Golden retriever energy, easy laugh, sold insurance for a living, and somehow made that sound impressive at every holiday dinner. My dad, Frank, is a retired plant foreman who did 2 years of stateside National Guard duty back in the 80s and has been dining out on it ever since. My mom, Linda, has spent 30 years smoothing over whatever Frank says so nobody has to sit with it too long. And then there's me. I did 11 years in the Army, most of it in units I'm still not allowed to name in casual conversation. I came home quieter than I left. I didn't talk about it, partly because I couldn't, legally, and partly because every time I tried to say even a sanitized version of what I'd done, I'd watch my dad's eyes glaze over like I was describing a paperwork error. So I stopped trying. I let the silence sit there. And into that silence, my family poured their own story about me. The version where I'd had some kind of breakdown overseas, gotten quietly discharged, come home different, and never really explained myself. Nobody asked. They just filled in the blank with whatever made the least effort to understand. I want to be clear, I never let them believe I was a coward on purpose. I just never corrected it, because correcting it would have meant explaining things I'd sworn not to explain. There's a particular kind of loneliness in being misjudged by people who love you, when the truth that would fix it is the one thing you're not allowed to say out loud. You carry it anyway. You just carry it quietly, and you tell yourself it doesn't matter what they think, because you know what actually happened. It mattered. I just didn't let myself say that part for a long time. The scar came from an extraction that went sideways in a place I still can't put on a form. Shrapnel and a field tourniquet cinched a little too fast by a medic who was doing his absolute best under fire. It healed into a thick, pale line across my left wrist, the kind of mark that makes strangers look twice and then look away. My family saw it exactly once, right after I got home, and my dad's only comment was, "Looks like you tried to open a can of beans the hard way." My mother laughed. Mark changed the subject to his fantasy football league. Nobody asked how I got it. Nobody asked if I was okay. I remember standing in that kitchen thinking, so this is what 6 years overseas earns you. A joke about canned beans. I kept a private tally after that, though I never called it that at the time. Every dismissive comment, every eye roll when I said I couldn't talk about something, every time my dad introduced me at a barbecue as my son, he was in the Army for a while, like it was a phase, like it was community college, I filed it away. I didn't do anything with it. I just kept count. It's a strange kind of arithmetic, tallying the small cuts against the version of yourself only you know is real. You tell yourself the ledger doesn't need balancing. You tell yourself that for years. Mark, meanwhile, got the full parade treatment for selling someone a decent life insurance policy. My dad would light up talking about Mark's career trajectory at parties. I got introduced, when I got introduced at all, with a small joke and a subject change. I used to tell myself it didn't bother me, that I'd chosen a life where recognition wasn't the point. That was true, as far as it went. But there's a difference between not needing recognition from strangers and not getting basic respect from your own father. I conflated those for longer than I should have. Then Mark met Sarah. I didn't meet her right away. She and Mark did the long-distance thing for almost a year before she rotated back stateside, and by the time I actually shook her hand, I'd already heard about her secondhand for months. My mother described her as very serious and hard to read, which, translated from Linda speak, meant Sarah didn't laugh at my dad's jokes on command. I liked her before I even met her, honestly, just on that basis alone. What nobody in my family seemed to fully register, or maybe chose not to dwell on, because it complicated the easy narrative, was that Sarah Reyes was a captain, Special Forces, the kind of officer who doesn't talk about her work at dinner parties either, for exactly the reasons I didn't talk about mine. My dad treated this fact the way he treated most things he didn't understand. He flattened it into something he could joke about. Our little G.I. Jane, he called her once, right to her face, at a cookout. She smiled thin and said nothing. I remember thinking, that's not nothing. That's restraint, and being the only one at that table who recognized the difference. I'd started, quietly, rebuilding a life that had nothing to do with proving anything to my family. I worked in private sector risk consulting by then, the kind of job that uses everything I learned and none of the parts I'm not allowed to discuss. I had a small apartment, a short list of people from my old unit I still trusted completely, and an understanding, hard one, that my worth didn't depend on my father ever updating his opinion of me. I believe that. Mostly. There's a difference between believing something and having it tested. The test came in the form of an engagement party invitation. Mark and Sarah were getting married, and my parents threw them an engagement party at my dad's favorite banquet hall, the kind of place with a chandelier that's slightly too big for the room and a bar that only serves domestic beer unless you ask twice. I almost didn't go. My oldest friend from the unit, a guy named Ray Ferris who'd pulled me out of that extraction with the tourniquet scar to prove for it, told me I should. You don't owe them a performance, he said, but you also don't have to keep hiding from your own life because they never grew up. Ray had a way of saying the thing I needed to hear without dressing it up. I went. I stood near the back for most of the night, the way I usually did at these things, nursing a beer and watching my dad work the room like he'd personally arranged the marriage. At some point, he caught sight of me by the drinks table and decided, apparently, that this was the moment for a bit. Sarah, honey, come here. You haven't met my other son yet, he said, waving me over with the particular theatrical energy he reserved for moments he thought were charming. Sarah crossed the room, poised, polite, the kind of composed that comes from years of not needing to prove anything to a room. My dad put a hand on my shoulder, the way he does when he's about to say something he thinks is funny. This is Daniel, he said. He's just a guest tonight, the coward who abandoned his unit. He laughed at his own joke before he even finished it. A few people near us laughed too, the reflexive kind of laugh you give when someone senior in the room laughs first, and you don't want to be the one who doesn't. My mother gave a small, apologetic smile in my direction, the smile that meant she wasn't going to say anything. Not tonight, not ever. Mark didn't laugh, but he didn't correct him either. He just looked at his shoes. Here's the thing about that particular tally I'd kept for years without naming it. It isn't really about any single comment. It's about how quiet you get inside when the pattern confirms itself one more time, in public, at your own brother's engagement party, in front of strangers. I felt that old, familiar drop in my stomach. I kept my face still. I've had a lot of practice keeping my face still. Sarah extended her hand to me, polite, professional, the handshake of someone who'd shaken 1,000 hands at official functions and knew how to do it without giving anything away. Nice to finally meet you, she said. I took her hand. That's when her eyes moved, just slightly, to my wrist, to the scar my sleeve had ridden up over without me noticing. Her smile didn't just fade. It stopped, the way a radio signal stops when you drive into a dead zone, mid-transmission, cut clean. She was still holding my hand, but she wasn't shaking it anymore. She was staring at the scar, and then at my face, with an expression I recognized instantly because I'd worn it myself, more than once, in rooms full of people who had no idea what they were looking at. Wait, she said, quiet enough that only the people closest to us could hear it. You're the ghost call sign, aren't you? I want to tell you my heart didn't stop. It did. There are maybe 4 people alive outside my old chain of command who could connect that scar to that call sign, and I hadn't said a word to Sarah Reyes about either one. She wasn't guessing. She knew, which meant somewhere, in briefings I was never in the room for, in after-action reports with half the names redacted, my work had crossed paths with hers, or with someone close enough to her that the story had traveled the way stories do in that world, quietly, accurately, among people who understand exactly how much weight a call sign can carry when it's earned instead of assigned. My dad, still mid-laugh at his own joke, hadn't caught up yet. Ghost call sign? What's she talking about? Danny, you playing video games again? He said it loud, the way he says everything, and a couple of nearby guests chuckled again, uncertain, following his lead because that's what the room had learned to do around him. Sarah didn't laugh. She let go of my hand, took a half step back, and did something I will remember for the rest of my life. She straightened, The way people straighten when muscle memory takes over faster than thought. And for one full second, in the middle of a banquet hall with a too-big chandelier, a decorated Special Forces captain stood a little taller in front of me, an unmistakable gesture of respect, the kind reserved for people who've earned something the rest of the room has no framework for. Then she turned to my father. "Mr. Whitlow," she said, and her voice had changed completely. No longer the polite party voice, but something flatter, more precise, the voice of someone used to being obeyed. "I need you to understand something. The operation that gave your son that scar is one of maybe 6 things in my career I'm still not permitted to discuss in detail. I know it by outcome, not by name, because outcome is all that gets shared outside the unit that ran it. 14 people came home because of a decision your son made under fire that nobody trained him to make. They just hoped somebody would if it ever came to that. I've spent 4 years hoping I'd someday get to shake the hand of whoever that was. I did not expect it to be at my own engagement party. I did not expect it to be someone you just called a coward." The room had gone very quiet by then, the specific quiet of 40 people realizing simultaneously that they'd laughed at the wrong thing. My dad's face did the thing I described at the very beginning. The freeze, the color draining, the mouth caught open on a word that never finished forming. My mother's hand went to her chest. Mark just stared at me like he was seeing me for the first time in his life, which, in a way, he was. I didn't say anything for a long moment. Honestly, some part of me had spent 6 years rehearsing this moment without meaning to, and now that it had arrived, I found I didn't want the speech I'd never let myself write. I just wanted to breathe. "It's fine," I finally said, to the room more than to my dad. "He didn't know. He didn't ask," Sarah said, quietly, not unkindly, but not backing down either. "That's different." That was the line that did it, more than anything else that night. Not the reveal, not the almost salute, but that one flat sentence from a woman who'd only known me for 90 seconds and had already understood something my own father hadn't bothered to in 6 years. He didn't ask for words, and the whole architecture of the story my family had built about me, the coward, the guest, the one who was in the army for a while, just quietly came apart. My dad tried to recover, the way he always did, reaching for a joke to paper over the moment. "Well, I mean, nobody tells us anything. How were we supposed to?" He stopped himself this time. Maybe he heard how it sounded. Maybe, for once, the room's silence actually landed on him instead of bouncing off. I could have let the moment carry me further. I could have listed the tally out loud, the can of beans joke, the just a guest, the years of subject changes and careful non-questions. I had it all cataloged, every entry, and for one hot second I wanted to read the whole ledger aloud in front of everyone he'd ever wanted to impress. I didn't. Not because I forgave it in that moment. I hadn't. Not yet. But because I realized the ledger had already been settled, in a sense, by someone else's honesty instead of my own bitterness. I didn't need to win the room. The room had already changed its mind on its own. "I'm going to get some air," I said, and I meant it plainly, not as a dramatic exit line. Sarah caught my eye before I left and gave a small nod. Not pity, something closer to professional respect passed between two people who understood a certain kind of silence. I stood outside the banquet hall for a while, in the parking lot, under a string of lights someone had hung for the party and clearly hadn't planned to be seen from this angle. Mark came out a few minutes later, hands in his pockets, looking like a man doing long division in his head. "You could have told me," he said. "I couldn't," I said. "That was never really the choice on the table." He nodded slowly, like he was actually turning that over instead of just performing acceptance of it. "Dad's a mess in there," he added, after a while. "He'll be a mess for a night," I said. "Then he'll find a way to make it a story where he comes out fine." I wasn't being cruel saying it. I just watched him do it my whole life. I didn't go back inside that night. I told Mark I was happy for him, genuinely, and I meant it. None of this was his fault, and Sarah, it turned out, was exactly the kind of person our family needed more of. Someone who simply refused to let a lazy story stand uncorrected. I drove home with the windows down, and somewhere around the second highway exit, I realized my hands weren't shaking anymore. They had been, the whole drive out of that parking lot, and I hadn't noticed until they stopped. My dad called 2 days later. It wasn't quite an apology. Frank Whitlow doesn't really do those in the classic sense, but it was closer than anything I'd gotten from him in 15 years. He asked, for the first time in my adult life, what I actually did over there. Not the redacted version. Just what was it like? I told him some of it. Not all of it, because some things still aren't mine to give away, but more than I'd ever told him before, because for the first time he was actually asking instead of assuming. I didn't rush to rebuild everything. I want to be honest about that. I saw him a handful of times over the following months, and it was better. Careful, a little stilted, both of us aware of the weight sitting in the room between us, but better. My mother started asking questions too, small ones, tentative, the kind of questions that meant she'd finally noticed the blank space where a person used to be and wanted to fill it in correctly this time. I let her. Slowly. Sarah and I became something like friends, in an odd, specific way. Two people who understood each other's silences better than either of our families ever had. At the wedding, months later, she pulled me aside before the toasts and said, quietly, I never got to properly thank the person whose call saved 14 lives. So thank you. I told her she didn't need to say it twice. She said she knew. She said it anyway. My dad gave a toast that night. He mentioned Mark's career, as expected. And then, almost as an afterthought, almost like it cost him something to say it plainly, he mentioned that his younger son had served with distinction in ways their family was only beginning to understand, and that he was proud of both his sons, equally, and had been for a long time, even when he hadn't shown it well. It wasn't eloquent. It wasn't the speech I used to imagine getting, back when I still imagined getting one. But it was true, as far as it went, and I'd learned by then not to demand more truth from people than they're capable of giving all at once. I think about that ledger sometimes, the one I never named out loud, the tally of every small dismissal stacked up against every quiet thing I actually did and couldn't explain. I don't keep it the same way anymore. Somewhere in that parking lot, under those string lights, I think I finally understood that the ledger was never going to be settled by anyone else's apology. It got settled the moment I stopped needing it to be. He didn't ask. That's different. I think about that line more than almost anything else from that night. Because it wasn't really about my father. It was about all of us. Everyone who's ever been quietly misjudged by the people closest to us, simply because it was easier for them not to ask. If that's you, if you've been the one everyone assumed the worst about because the truth was inconvenient or classified or just never asked for, I see you. I'd love to hear your version of that moment. The one where somebody finally asked, or the one where nobody ever did and you had to hand yourself the recognition instead. Drop it in the comments. I read every one.